Good morning, everyone. It's Mark from counsellingsupervision.com.au. In my last group supervision meeting, we discussed addictions counselling. Now, that's a broad topic. It's a very broad topic. We need to be careful as counsellors when we start working with addictions because there's so much to say about that one. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm not expertly trained in it. So there's probably people who know way more than I do about addictions. But hey, we can make a difference and at least be maybe a gap or a start for a person to get some more advanced counseling on that if they need it. So I thought it would be useful to discuss. So what we discussed, and I've got a couple of things in front of me here, but some things you want to be careful of when we're looking at as counselors at addictions is our own staff. So you need to be careful of that one. So what challenges do we face as counselors when working with addictions? Well, one is stigma and bias. Believe it or not, we are human beings and have opinions about stuff as counselors. So you might have a preconceived idea about alcohol, drugs, gambling, porn, you mentioned it, retail shopping, whatever the addiction might be, and that could affect your work with the client. So you need to be able to bracket that out in academic terms to make sure that that doesn't influence your work. And you might also have this idea that you want to save people potentially. So when we work with addictions, I have that, maybe you don't, but I've had that where someone comes in with an addiction problem and I feel I have to help them because their addiction is such a bad thing and they need to get rid of that. It's all dependent on them. I might not agree with the addiction or with the substance or with the behavior that these people are doing, but they need to be ready to change. And we'll talk about that. It doesn't matter what I think of this. So always keep that in mind. It's not about me. It's like, oh, you've got such a bad addiction going on. Let me help you. No, it's about the client wanting help. And if they don't want help, or if their solution to the problem is a minimized or reduced version of what they're doing that still doesn't sit very well with you, then that might well be all that you can do with the client and all that's needed for them. So that's one, stigma and bias. The second one is what I talked about earlier, the complexity of addiction. Addiction is often a comorbid thing, so it often happens together with something else, and that could be depression, anxiety, trauma, stress, you mentioned it. So we need to take that into account. And there might be systemic problems going on with this client as well. It could be that there is a genetic component. It could be that there's a societal or environmental component as well. So it could be poverty, homelessness, legal trouble. It could be that the environment that the client hangs around with, family, friends, social circle, are all prone to having the same addictive problems. And then you can't just look at the addiction as such. We'll need to look at the broader aspect of it, and that might very quickly exceed our capabilities. And then maybe social workers or occupational therapists or other people might have to jump in as well. The third thing is resistance and relapse. You can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that clients will lapse. Lapse is one occasion of going back to the behavior that they don't want to do. Relapse is full-blown regression to the behavior that they don't want to do. And that's going to happen. If you can't deal with that as a counselor, that's a problem because clients will most likely relapse or lapse, and they will most likely be very resistant to changing, even though you and potentially the client logically can see that what they're doing is not helpful, but to actually change their behavior is tough. So relapse and lapses are a natural part of recovery, and resistance is a normal facet of addictions counseling as well, and we need to work with that. Fourth thing is emotional burnout. I think when you work with people with addictions problems, whether it's behaviors or substances, it's tricky. It's emotionally draining, and we as counselors need to look after ourselves when it comes to that. And not get too burnt out and not get too caught up in the complexity of what's going on. If it's an individual client here and there that you're working with, probably not that big an issue. But if you work in addictions counseling as your main counseling modality or your main counseling role, be very aware of emotional burnouts and compassion fatigue and all that sort of stuff. So careful. And then the last one, number 5, that I want to discuss are legal and ethical dilemmas. Confidentiality still rules. But if these people commit criminal acts in order to sustain their addictive behavior, you may actually have to take action at some point and break confidentiality. Now, if you work for an organization, there'll probably be organizational rules and policies and procedures around that. But if you work in private practice and you get caught up in that, and I've had that once where a client was addicted to pain medication and had so much of these pain medications because you was only taking them sparingly. So you had boxes full and he kept filling a script. And then ultimately a friend of his started crushing these things and selling them on the market as well, pretty much as highs. That's not good. That's a criminal activity. And you might get into legal or ethical conflict with that one. So talk to your supervisor about that. So those things are something you need to be aware of when you start working with addictions already. That's the first thing you definitely need to work at. Now, what modalities would you use? The gold standard, and I'll do another little video at some point about that one, is motivational interviewing in addiction education, and I teach some addiction stuff at uni. MI always comes up, motivational interviewing. It's one of the, well, not best, that's a weird word, but it's a very effective way of dealing with addictions because it stimulates intrinsic desire to change. That's the idea. So hopefully through working with MI and you working with the client with motivational interviewing, ultimately the client comes to a conclusion that changing their behavior for them is the best thing to do. Not because you tell them it's the best thing to do, but they come to that conclusion. And you can do that through all sorts of means. Again, I'll talk about that another day at some point if you don't know about MI. But it's very client-centered, but quite a directed and directive, goal-oriented, evidence-based, strength-based modality to work with addictive behaviors and to explore ambivalence about change, but to also to get them to collaborate and to work with you on changing their behavior. Another one is good old CBT. Gotta love CBT. I do. So CBT definitely works with addictive behaviors. ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, can be very useful to work with people with addiction problems. And then there's obviously things like the 12-step recovery programs and all sorts of other stuff. Don't forget trauma-informed care, trauma-informed modalities. Very likely there's some element of trauma behind the addictive behavior, and it's well worthwhile exploring that and then using potentially other modalities like EMDR or other expressive or somatic therapies on that one to help the client process the trauma. So keep that in mind too. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into all the assessments because most counselors, we're not psychologists. There's a few you can use. The CAGE assessment I often use for people with addictions problems. There's the audit, AUDIT. Then there's the DAST, and there's a couple other ones. So find a few online. There's plenty of them. You can work with that. And I think the most important thing for us is to start working in an initial counseling setting with the stages of change. So if you've ever heard of Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change, they talk about these stages that clients go through when they are addicted and work and want to change or potentially don't want to change, but the stages that people go to. So the first one, and I've got to open up this thing because I've got jog my memory a little bit. So here we go. So the first one, and I know that one, but is the pre-contemplation stage. So when people are in pre-contemplation, they actually don't think they have a problem. These are the clients that get sent by their husbands or wives or family members. And the classic response is, my wife sent me, or my brother thought it would be a good idea to come and see you. So that is already an indication that these people potentially out of their own accord wouldn't have come and visited you. But hey, someone close to them said, it'd be a good idea if you do. And they want to please the other person. So why not? Let's go and visit this dude or girl, whoever you are. So pre-contemplation, these people are generally not considering what they're doing a problem. So I don't have a problem with my drinking. It's my family who has a problem with my drinking, but I'm okay. So what would you do when a client comes in with and turns out to be a pre-contemplator? Well, you can't do much. You can link the behavior and the effects of the behavior. You can psychoeducate them a little bit on the effects of their behavior just by looking at statistics or looking at fact sheets or looking at health stuff. So education is most likely, the way to go, but not in a judgmental, normative way, but in a friendly way. It's like, do you know what alcohol does to a body? Have you ever explored that? Or do you know what the effects of these drugs are in the long term on your body? Or do you know how long cannabis actually stays into your system, in your system, and then what that can do to, for instance, your driving license? Just some statistical stuff to get these people to think about what's going on and how their problems in life might be related to this. So it's a good thing to do. So pre-contemplators, tough crowd. They generally, or not generally, but they often don't stick around just because they don't think that what's going on is an issue, and you're the one that's now bugging them in a way. The contemplators, they generally do realize that something's going on. They have some idea about the good or the not so good of their behavior, and they want to change, but they don't know how. So, or they do know how, but they're very ambivalent about changing. So what would you do with a person like that? Contemplators, well, explore that ambivalence. Why is what you're doing so helpful, or why do you like it so much? But on the other hand, why would you like to change? What's going on, and why is it so hard for you to change? So have a chat about the ambivalence that these people feel towards changing, and increase their awareness about the upsides of potentially changing. So it sounds really mean to do, but sometimes it's good to highlight the negative effects of what's going on for them. So what their behavior is doing. So highlight the negatives and highlight the positives of the changed behavior or the benefits of stopping. And that can work because then they'll ultimately, hopefully, get into what they call the preparation phase. So contemplators ideally turn into preparators, where they realize that something's going on. They want to do something about it. They have made a decision that they want to change, and hopefully you can be the one to help them. So what would you do with a preparator? Well, your task is working on strengthening commitment. So your work will be all about options for treatment, goals, which pathways to choose, planning, accountability, all that sort of stuff. So to map out a roadmap for them, to map out the journey on what's out there, what can they do. So you can become a bit of an accountability partner and an expert advisor if you know about that stuff. So that's where you would want to do research, or potentially have some access to local organizations, or at least have a Rolodex or an information sheet for this client, so they can start making phone calls, or you can make phone calls for them. The action takers, that's the next step. So preparation ideally leads to action. That's where accountability comes in, executing the plan. So these people are taking steps, they're doing it, they want to do it, and you want to acknowledge whatever goes on through their journey. Emotions might come up, they might feel like a failure, they might have doubts, second guess themselves, or they might kick some proper goals and going really well. So you become their cheerleader and their supporter along the way. And relapse prevention becomes, or well, not necessarily, there and also in the maintenance phase, but relapse prevention becomes a good point. So you want to work with that on them. Then the maintenance phase, that's a tough one for maintenance, to keep up the good action. That's the same as in action taking, obviously. There's like, okay, you're in the journey, you're doing it. So the maintenance phase is a big one, and that's definitely around relapse prevention. That's a big one. So keep reassuring them that they're doing well, help them when they fall off the wagon, help them get back up, evaluate their progress, give them a good old feather in their cap, make sure they feel supported, give them a leg up if they need it, and explain to them that the journey is not necessarily easy, but it's worth it. So you stay with them. And that doesn't have to be just you. It could be family members and friends as well. Now, the relapse phase or the lapse phase, that's also part of that cycle of Prochaska and DiClemente. That's when normalizing becomes really a good thing for you to do. Because people will most likely lapse or relapse. I've done some quit smoking training out west in the gas industry here in Queensland. And for the quit smoking, they kind of expect professionally that people will lapse about 5 or 6 times and go back to their old behavior. But as long as they're constantly willing to recommit to cutting back or to quitting altogether, they'll probably get there. So you psychoeducate people on the fact that if they start smoking again, it's not a biggie. We actually kind of expect you to do that, and it's part of the process. So normalizing psychoeducation, and again, remaining a cheerleader and helping these people to keep moving. So that's what you would be doing with that. So that's a real quick overview. I've gone for a couple of minutes already. I haven't kept track of time, but when you work with addictions, keep that in mind. There's things that we have to keep in mind as addictions counselors, or when you work with clients with addictions, traps that we can fall for. And then there's ways to work with these people, and there's lots more to learn about that one. And that's what we half discussed, or discussed a little bit, the highlights of it anyway, in the supervision session. Now, I will do another one on motivational interviewing at some stage, because it's kind of a cool tool. But if you want to know more, always just learn more. Sign up for some courses, potentially just delve into it, become a specialist in it. But don't just dive into working with people with addictions before you've done some research into it. You have a few tools in your modality toolkit that you can work with. You have some knowledge about these cycles of change, or the stages of change. You got some idea on working with motivational interviewing or ACT or CBT or trauma-informed work. And also keep in mind that there might be systemic issues that keeps the client going back to their old habits. It's got nothing to do with the work with you, but just they're with the wrong crowd or in the wrong environment that might keep pulling them back. And don't let that disappoint you, because when it does work and when people do change, that's quite a cool feeling. So if you want to know more about that one, feel free to contact me as always. Love to have a chat. If you got comments or questions, then yep, you know where to find me too. And I definitely look forward to to having a chat with you. And otherwise, until the next video, speak soon.